to champion the conservative principles which he fought for, as well as complement the mission of National Review magazine. Our educational programming across the country brings together leaders from all walks of life to promote the principles of a free society. One of the ways we do that is to partner with great state-based think tanks like Show Me Institute to bring our top talent across the country. Of course, in normal times, we'd be doing this in person, and I will look forward to doing that with you all. I know many of you who are on the call today. I look forward to seeing you all when we can do it again in person, but we've been pleased to host many virtual calls over the last few months, and I'm really looking forward to today's. Before I introduce Brenda Talent, our friend at Show Me Institute, I did want to promote one special event that NRI has coming up, and that's our annual William F. Buckley Jr. Prize Gala. This year it's going to be a virtual event on October 5th, and you can visit nrinstitute.org to learn more and to register. This year we're honoring two great Americans, James Buckley, little brother to William F. Buckley Jr. and former US Senator, and Virginia James, who has been a great philanthropist in the conservative movement. It will be an exciting, great interactive event. It will be highly produced. It will not be a Zoom call. And we do hope that you can join us. Again, you can visit nrinstitute.org. Before I introduce Kevin, I'd like to turn over to Brenda to talk a little bit about Show Me Institute. And before you do, Brenda, thank you so much for hosting this event with us today.
Well, thank you, Chris. The Show Me Institute is pleased to partner with the National Review Institute to bring everyone this program. For those of you who don't know us, the Show Me Institute is an independent research and education organization. We focus on Missouri fiscal and economic policies from a free market lens. You know, we don't believe that more government is the solution to every problem. Instead, we promote solutions to the problems facing our citizens from the perspective of what can we do to unleash the creativity and power of individuals. We want Missouri to be a place where entrepreneurs are free to pursue their dreams, where parents direct the upbringing and education of their children, and where government acts in a way to enhance freedom and independence. You know, during these challenging times, it's critical that voices such as ours are not muted. We know that a better America lies in individual liberty and responsibility, really a return to limited government and a renewed commitment to free enterprise. So politicians come and go, but the power of ideas remain, and that's where the Show Me Institute steps in. So please learn more about us at showmeinstitute.org or on Facebook, Twitter. And with that, we are really pleased to partner with National Review Institute. And I'm going to turn the program back over to you, Chris, because everyone wants to hear from Kevin.
Thank you so much, Brenda. For those of you joining us on the call, there will be some time for questions, Q&A at the end here. So at about 25 to 30 after, I'll hop back on and we'll have some chance to answer your questions. Please use the chat box feature on the bottom of your screen to enter one of those questions. And like I said, I'll try to facilitate getting us through all of them by the end of our time today. So I'm very pleased to introduce Kevin Williamson, who's with us today. Kevin is a fellow with National Review Institute and National Review Magazine's Roving Correspondent. He writes the weekly newsletter called The Tuesday, which I strongly recommend you subscribe to. I think it's must read every week. I absolutely look forward to it in my inbox every week, and it's a great recap of the events of the week and a little look into what's on Kevin's brain. Kevin's also the author of The Smallest Minority, Independent Thinking in the Age of Mob Politics. There's actually a copy of it on my shelf right behind me that I see. He's formerly served as theater critic at the New Criterion and taught at the King's College, as well as being a Pulliam Fellow at Hillsdale College. He started his career in journalism with the Bombay-based Indian Express newspaper group and spent 15 years in the newspaper business in Texas, Pennsylvania, and Colorado, currently living in Texas. He's also served as the editor-in-chief of 3 newspapers and was founding editor of Philadelphia's Bulletin. His work has appeared in the New York Post and Commentary, among other publications. And today, we're thrilled that he's here to talk to us all about his upcoming new book entitled Big White Ghetto, Stone Broke, Stone Cold Stupid, High on Rage, and the Dank Woolly Wilds of the Real America. It's a mouthful. It will be available on October 27th, and we will put a copy to the Amazon link in the chat box. So if you haven't already pre-ordered it, please do. Kevin's going to give us a good taste of what we can expect in the book, and then I'll come back for Q&A in a little bit. So Kevin, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. It's always fun to talk to policy people who are interested in solutions and such things, because I don't really have any. I have a lot of stories though, and if you don't mind, I'm actually going to read part of one to you from the book, which is a collection of long reported pieces about various kinds of social issues. And this is from a story called Boy. Not very vascular, says recovering addict Drew Callner. So I had to shoot up on the outside of my arm, which meant looking at myself in the mirror. There was just something about that, 5 or 6 times a day, looking yourself in the eye and seeing the deterioration and hating it. Another young addict tells a different but similar story. I remember using dull needles and having to stab myself until I found a vein, recovering addict Dalton Smith says. But I was obsessed with when you got the needle in and pulling it back and seeing the blood, the red flag. Smith sometimes shot up imaginary heroin, convinced that bits of carpet lint were the real thing. The fuzz, he says. I remember seeing the fuzz from the carpet in my rig. None of these guys comes from Heartbreak Hill. Some of them came from money, came from good schools, went to college, had successful high-income parents. But there's also divorce and addiction in the family. One young recovering addict is in the precarious situation of having to live with an alcoholic father. And there's a general sense of directionlessness. They're from that vast, great America whose people simultaneously have too much and too little. 1 or 2 breaks in a different direction, and Dalton Smith might have been the youth minister at your church. He still might be. He's got that heartbreakingly distinctive shamefacedness that you see whenever you're around young addicts or young prisoners, and there's some substantial overlap in that Venn diagram. Or other young people with woeful self-inflicted injuries, shadow across the face that says, well, he might be trying to have faith in whatever higher power there is that sets his almighty hand on recovering junkies in Alabama, that everything happens for a reason and that he's right where he's supposed to be. He'd really give anything to be able to go back and change one thing on the chain of decisions that led to his messing up his life nearly irreparably before he was old enough to rent a car from Avis. He's 22 years old. There's a long chain of bad decisions that goes back to the beginning of his self-destructive career as a drug addict, and its beginning as a 12-year-old boy. 10 years later, he knows a lot of different words for heroin. Down here, he says, they sometimes call it boy. So that's a bit from one of the stories in the piece in the book. I guess there are about 20 or 25 different stories in there, a lot of them about addiction, various kinds of dysfunction, poverty, homelessness. And I suppose there are 2 broad themes in the book, one of which is institutional failures in public life, and the other is a kind of failure in private life. The institutional failures, of course, will be more well known to people who follow politics and who follow public policy debates, because we have seen this kind of institutional decay in cities and states and at the federal level around the country, where there are organizations from the schools to the American Medical Association to the government itself, to the state legislatures, to the police departments, that for some reason or another seem either incapable or unwilling to do their job. One of the examples of institutional failure that I write about quite extensively is the issue of casino gambling, which is, to me, a really very revealing issue. Gambling is something that went in a relatively short period of time from being considered a serious vice to being kind of a harmless indulgence to being part of some cities and regions' economic development plans. And it's interesting to me that gambling gets sold to people as a program for economic development, because outside of the very special case of Las Vegas, there's almost no evidence that gambling works that way. Even in places like Atlantic City, which is a destination for gambling with a lot of casinos, and for all the lockdown and all that, a great deal of tourism, they estimate there that gambling still costs them as a region more than it produces in terms of revenue, incomes, taxes, that sort of thing. because it brings with it a lot of troubles that require a lot of expensive interventions. In Atlantic City, 1 out of 5 homeless people report that gambling is the proximate cause of their situation, that they lost their housing after losing their money from gambling. But the way it works, of course, is that governments are a partner in the business, and so they get most of the profit. And so politicians get revenue that they can use right now for whatever projects they want to put it toward. And the costs are things that can be dispersed, pushed off onto third parties, or that don't often become really apparent until some point in the future. So the inability to think long-term versus think short-term, the inability to see the actual relationship between costs and benefits is, I think, a real hallmark of American institutional failure, particularly in the public sector, but not only in the public sector. And gambling, again, I think is a really interesting way to highlight this, because it's so difficult to calculate the overall social costs and economic costs that are associated with it. Even in Las Vegas, for instance, which is the gambling success story, and a place where I lived for a while, and it's a very fine city. But there are, there's all sorts of economic development and social development that doesn't happen there because of gambling. For instance, Las Vegas didn't have an NFL team until this year, specifically because the NFL didn't want to be associated, however distantly, with gambling, and they simply wouldn't extend a franchise there until fairly recently. So a healthy society has institutions that can manage those kinds of dilemmas of the long-term versus the short-term, the concentrated benefits versus the dispersed costs. But that requires a certain level of political maturity and political and social sophistication that I'm afraid that we are increasingly finding ourselves without. And one of the problems that we have is that we as Americans tend to overgeneralize from principles or overgeneralize from single examples. Again, to take the case of Las Vegas, it's one thing for a country as big and diverse as ours, a country with 325 million people or 330 million people, to have one Las Vegas in it, just like it's not a bad thing to have one New Orleans or one Miami Beach. But you don't want the whole country to be like that. You don't want to have the problems and pathologies associated with those places dispersed in a more general way and to become more general social norms. I mean, there's a great deal of value, I think, in genuine diversity, which means that cities and regions are different from one another, and they've got different practices and different ideas about what's acceptable, not acceptable, what's legal, what's not legal. But we tend to say, well, it seems to be working in Vegas, let's try it in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, or let's try it in Connecticut, or let's try it. I think they were going to build a casino at Valley Forge, may have been built, I'm not sure. You don't want Las Vegas everywhere. You don't want New Orleans everywhere. I love New Orleans, it's one of my favorite cities, but you can't have a whole country that is that contains what they contain, I think. And so part of what I'm trying to do in my reporting is write about these places, write about the issues associated with them and what it really looks like, not from a question of policy analysis so much, but from what it really looks like, from the point of view on the ground. So I spent some time in Atlantic City, for instance, writing about gambling. And I was living in New York at the time. And I took the Greyhound bus back from Atlantic City to the Port Authority bus station on a Sunday morning. And it's called the Lucky Streak. And no one on it is feeling lucky, I promise you. I can't think of anything I've ever seen that was actually more depressing and despair-inducing in the United States anyway, than the scene of the people who were getting on the Greyhound after spending a weekend gambling in Atlantic City and trying to get back to New York. People who there was a guy who lost his pants somehow, just no pants. There was, of course, prostitution going on in the parking lot and people panhandling because they didn't have enough money for bus fare because they'd lost everything. And there are little things that you start to notice, like in casinos, you can take money out of an ATM without putting in a PIN. Because they don't want to have any steps that are standing in the way between you getting the money out and the money getting in their pocket. The industry term for the ideal situation In gambling, they call it play to extinction, meaning that the player plays until he literally has no resources left and all of his money has been transferred to the casino. I don't think that's probably a real great model of economic development. I mean, I'm a libertarian. I think that, people should be allowed to gamble if they want to gamble, but having this become a kind of state-run industry and have the government be a partner in it and have this be your vision of how your city is going to get built or your region is going to get built or how you're going to pay your bills, I think is not only going to be ineffective, but it's also immoral and irresponsible. But people don't think very far in the future, and people don't deal very well with these kinds of complicated questions. And part of that's just a weird American, delusional thing that we have. I spent some time in a homeless encampment in Austin. They call it Rat Town. It's rat with 2 T's, which stands for Responsible Adult Transition Town. And Rat Town is the inevitable result of politics where the governor of Texas and the mayor of Austin were fighting about the homelessness situation there in Austin. And the city decided, well, we're going to clean up all these homeless encampments. Then decided, well, we're probably not. And they couldn't quite work up the political will to do it or not do it. And so the state set aside 5 acres of land kind of on the edge of town, this area called Montopolis, and said, well, we can put the homeless people here. We'll make this the place they can camp. And so they were pushed out there. And what it created, of course, was a little village full of people who are, in many cases, suffering from mental illness, suffering from addiction problems, and suffering from a general inability to manage their lives. And it's not a way to solve a problem, of course, but it's a way to put a problem behind a fence, put it behind a gate, and keep it out of the nice parts of town. And that essentially is something that is a workable political fix for a while in a certain context, not solving the problem, but pushing it away. And talking to the people who lived there, I was reminded of the old observation that America never really got a socialist movement because it never really had a proletariat, because poor Americans and working class Americans don't think of themselves as an exploited underclass. They think of themselves as, I think the phrase was, temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And I relied on that a few times. And one of the people I was talking to in this homeless camp was saying that she had signed up for an online degree program in entrepreneurship because she didn't want to hold down a job because she liked to do different things and wanted to be able to change occupations ever so often. But of course, she wasn't able to take her classes because she doesn't have a computer or an internet connection, or indeed a home. She was living in a tent at the time and cooking over a fire, and she was building a fire pit in front of her tent when I talked to her. She had a daughter who didn't live with her, who was sitting in a car listening to music. And she said she visits her on the weekends, but she doesn't want her to stay there overnight because it's unsafe. And that to me was just a really telling typical American thing of this woman who was homeless and living in a tent, but she envisions herself as a serial entrepreneur. And so when it's going to go out and start some businesses and be an independent entrepreneur, if she could only get through this online class. And that is just purely delusional American thinking, and we get a lot of that at certain quarters of our society. There was another guy in the camp I talked to who said he was looking to do a career in media of some kind. He wasn't quite sure what he meant by that, but he thought that looked like a good way of living. So our inability to deal with those things are the institutional failures that I write about, and the public sector failures. The private failures are the bigger part of the story, I think. And I don't use that word private or personal failure in a sense that I mean it to be insulting or condemnatory. It's just that we have people who are unable to launch in life, who are unable to form families, relationships, hold down jobs, become reasonably self-sufficient members of families and communities, that sort of thing. This isn't, to wag fingers at them, but we need to look, I think, honestly at what causes this, what it's rooted in, what the psychology of it is, and to understand it as both a moral and spiritual failure, one that can be addressed, but it can't really be effectively addressed if we won't tell ourselves the truth about it. One of the things I write a lot about is how this particularly affects men, and especially young men. I wrote a piece about a pornography convention also in Las Vegas. And it's this annual thing they have there. It's like the Oscars for the porn world. And there are men who travel from all over the country who aren't involved in the business. They just go there as tourists, and they buy these very expensive tickets, $400-500 to spend the weekend. And it's a trade show essentially, and they go get autographs and take photos and that sort of thing. And I interviewed a lot of these guys, and there was a sense of resignation, being consigned that this is kind of where they are, and they'll sort of make the best of it. One of the themes that I get into is what I call the displacement of strength by cleverness. So the kind of traditional masculine virtues that we associate with kind of working class life in the post-war era, which is important not to romanticize, by the way. We have this idea in the 1950s you could just go down to a factory and get a job and have a good life and support a family. It's a lot more complicated than that. But there was a sense, and there is a sense, that there was a period of time when a man who was willing to work could go get a job, and his main qualification for the job was simply willingness to work, to do what he's asked, show up, sober and on time and all that stuff, and keep bolting fenders on those forts, even if you get tired, even if you don't want to do it anymore, even if it's monotonous. And through that kind of endurance, establish himself as an economically valuable person, and therefore a socially valuable person, and to achieve a kind of position that would allow him and his family not to feel any shame about their situation. And I think there's a strong sense that those kinds of opportunities have been greatly diminished. And the things that we used to rely on or think of as being the traditional masculine virtues, physical strength, courage, assertiveness, those sorts of things, are not really especially useful in a 21st century technological and communication-driven economy. And in some cases, they're the opposite of that. They come off as aggression or insufficient attention to risk and those sorts of things. And so the kinds of opportunities that exist for cleverness, whether it's cleverness with words, cleverness with technology, cleverness in finance, are not things that can be acquired through simple hard work. And they're largely nested in a kind of web of social relationships that people from outside that world just don't get. If you look at the story of, pick your favorite Silicon Valley startup, and look at how many degrees of social separation there were between the founder and the people who provided the initial investment capital, you'll find it's 1 or 2 degrees of separation in most cases. This is, it's not a closed caste that people can't get into. Talented people can do it, and that's part of what we have elite institutions of higher education and that sort of thing for. But for people who don't have those kinds of talents, who don't have that kind of cleverness, it's essentially a closed system that can't really be opened up or accessed by them. And so they feel stuck, and they feel excluded, and they feel like they're not in control of their world. And this is something that I saw a great deal of covering some of these alt-right events and things, malicious stuff that I write a couple of stories about, of these protests of people who, or flat earthers. I read a big thing about flat earthers too. And what they all have in common is a sense that the world is being controlled in a way that they are powerless to affect or influence, and that they don't really have any sense of agency over their own lives, and that they can't acquire the things they would need to have that sense of agency. And so in their desperation, they turn to, sometimes it's heroin, sometimes it's crackpot politics, sometimes it's, there are people whose job it is to be a flat earther. I mean, there are flat earth professional associations and conventions and stuff. People make a living furthering this conspiracy theory. And because they can't find a way into the sort of life that they would want, and the sort of life that would be truly satisfying to them. And that, I think, is a big part of what explains something we've been talking about in the last few years, the epidemic of deaths of despair, whether there's from drug overdoses, alcohol abuse, or suicide, or whether it's suicide as such, or the slow motion suicide of addiction and indifference. So anyway, the book is a collection of long reported pieces about those subjects. It goes from San Bernardino to New York City to Philadelphia to homeless encampments to drug rehabs and all sorts of other places. And I think there's some interesting and useful stuff in there. So we want to turn it over to Chris, and we will take questions. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Kevin. It's a great overview. I'm looking forward to reading it. Some questions coming in from our guests today. To what degree are so-called sin taxes effective market-based tools to mitigate the cost externalities you mentioned that society bears? Do you see pros and cons to those?
Yeah, almost none. So taxes really, I think, should be about revenue. There are certain things we need government to do, certain things we expect government to do. These things cost money. All taxes should do is raise that money in the least economically disruptive way possible. Using taxes as a kind of social policy is generally ineffective, and is generally politically dishonest as well. You know, for instance, in Texas, where I live, we've got this nonsense where they, tell people that the state lottery funds education. Well, it doesn't actually. I mean, we got one big pot of money like every state does. It goes into a general fund. It comes out of a general fund. The idea that this stuff is earmarked for education or veterans benefits or children or other sorts of things is all just dishonest political nonsense. And everyone who looks at this stuff seriously, I think, kind of knows that. We haven't seen taxes on things like alcohol and cigarettes really very much influence people's consumption level of those things. We have seen a great decrease in smoking as a result of a long, expensive, and sustained campaign of public education and social pressure. So smoking is now kind of a low-class thing in, pardon me, most communities. I was watching a movie the other day, and it was supposed to be set in the contemporary time, but everybody smoked. And I was thinking this must be based on some older source material. It turns out it was some novel from the 1970s. And it was The Burnt Orange Heresy is what it was, a movie with Mick Jagger in it as a corrupt art collector. A pretty good movie. And so we can influence people's behavior. I'm not a fan of prohibition by any stretch of the imagination, but don't let anyone tell you that prohibition didn't work. American alcohol consumption per capita crashed during prohibition. It fell by like 85% or something, some very large number. Now, that doesn't make it a good policy, but if you want to encourage something or you want to discourage something, attaching an excise to it is not really, I think, the most effective or intelligent way to do it.
Ted asks, it's been his experience that when conservatives see somebody who's a drug addict, obese, etc., they attribute it to a person being irresponsible. Liberals in general seem to tend to attribute it to poverty forcing the person to think short-term and long-term, delayed gratification issues. Mm-hmm. How do you see the balance between those factors impacting the individuals that you encounter? What do you find to be the real source there?
Well, it's wrong to, I think of this as an either or thing. There are individual factors. We all make our choices. There are social factors that shape and constrain people's lives. And one of the things it's very difficult to talk about because of the way such science has often been misused, but there are hereditary factors too. There are aspects of personality other than intelligence, which has been talked about extensively since the bell curve and that debate. But there are other aspects of people's personality that seem to be largely hereditary, largely present from the time of birth, not acquired over the course of life out of the force of habit. And these things are probably not changeable, or at least our ability to change them through public policy or through social pressure or education or other things is really quite limited. What we need and what we lack, I think, for really the truly most vulnerable people in our society is more functional families and communities. There isn't going to be any policy fix to homelessness in New York City, say, because it's largely a mental health problem, not an economic problem or a housing problem. I mean, there's all sorts of problems with affordable housing. We could get into all that sort of stuff, but in most cities, Dallas, where I live, Austin, certainly, Chicago, homelessness is overwhelmingly a mental health issue, largely an addiction issue. There are people who end up homeless who have mental health problems and social problems and personal problems that would not render someone like me homeless. wouldn't render someone who has two college-educated parents and a functional family and a community that has the kind of resources to help them deal with their problems. It wouldn't render them homeless. One of the problems, the sort of 60s and 70s social revolution, is that the overly indulgent habits of the upper classes got spread to lower classes that couldn't afford them. And that's maybe a cruel and overly economic way of thinking about things. But there's a lot of stuff you can get away with if you're a movie star or a rock star that's not going to ruin your life. That if you're someone who has a job that pays $11 an hour, is going to ruin your life and is going to have horrifying consequences for you and your family that you can't recover from. So yeah, it's a bearable problem. And as I was writing with the case of this particular heroin addict who got my attention, yeah, he chose to become what he was. There's a longer discussion of this in the book of a guy saying that he's talking to a guy before he shoots up for the first time. And the guy says, if you do this, there's going to be no turning back. You are going to become a drug addict. That's what happens. And which is probably overstating the case, but that's what he was told. And the guy said, well, bring it on. And at one point you want to say, well, okay, you made your bed, you lie in it. The other part you have to say he was 14 years old and or 15 years old or however old he was. And so a lot of these situations you're seeing, again, particularly young men in situations that have their roots in decisions they made when they were 12, 13, 14 years old. And it's quite difficult to get people off of that track and onto another track, particularly if they end up as convicted felons. They end up with, permanent mental and psychological disabilities or physical disabilities due to the choices they've made. These are not things that are going to really respond to policy fixes. What we lack is families and community, I think.
Not too far removed from that topic, and you talked a little bit about deaths of despair. To what extent is that phenomenon unique to our times, or has this always been a problem, but it's a little bit more visible because of the internet and kind of nationwide media? Is it growing? Is it an issue, or has it always been there?
Well, it's something that's present in the United States and in other cultures over time. In India, there were this epidemic of suicide among farmers at one point, just because their crops were failing. It was a particularly bad time in the agricultural business, and a lot of farmers killed themselves. Apparently, it's a myth about all the guys jumping out of the buildings after the stock market crash in 1929. But you do see higher levels of suicide among financial professionals during big downturns. Certainly happened after the financial crisis of 2008. So a few things about that. What's disruptive in life is maybe not what you expect it to be. So, for instance, divorces. A man is more likely to get a divorce after losing his job than he is after to be discovered to be cheating on his wife. So that's an interesting stat for me. And suicides are very, very common, or relatively common, among people who've recently lost work or who have suffered some other kind of economic setback that they don't expect to recover from. And that lack of a clear path of advancement in life is, I think, one of the key things that we do kind of need to deal with. And there are some policy pieces to it and some social pieces, not just with people who are in trouble, but particularly people who are young. And to have, a more honest conversation about most people are of average intelligence, of average ability. That's what it means to be average. That's what average means. And all of our political conversation and our social conversation is about how do we get more people to go to Harvard? How do we get more people to go to law school? And which is because our conversation is dominated by people who went to Harvard and who went to law school. And so they think, well, if people made the same choices I did, then they'll have happy lives like I have. But that's not really a realistic option for a lot of people. And so I think if you can get a man who is 15, 16 years old and show him a way forward, here's something you can do for a living. Here's a way for you to advance in life where you can have a family, have a place, have a job in a condition that you're not ashamed of, and that will give you a sense of connection and meaning and autonomy. And here are the steps you have to take. And even if those steps are really very hard and really very difficult, it's much, much harder and much more difficult to try to go through life without that kind of path. And I mean, we see it, in the experience of the military, we see it in other kinds of places where given a to-do list, given a way to move forward and a particular path of advancement, that young people can adapt themselves to that and do it. The problem is not knowing what needs to be done or not knowing how to discover what needs to be done.
Following on that, it's kind of a two-part question here. One is, how do we help people that are facing suicidal thoughts because of economic distress? How do we help those people? And maybe a somewhat related question. You talked earlier about kind of the willingness to work and how that used to be enough to kind of find gainful employment. We still hear a lot of rhetoric about manufacturing jobs being lost and trying to bring those back. Has that ship sailed? What is that path forward on finding somebody who's willing to work and finding them gainful employment in the 21st century economy?
Yeah, this has been a couple of years, so my information here is probably out of date. But I was in St. Louis a few years ago, since we're talking to folks in St. Louis, and there's a guy there I was interviewing who runs a great big industrial concern. It's a very large company that's kind of flies under the radar. And so naturally it's a chemistry heavy business. And so he hires a lot of chemical engineers and chemists, and he knows where to get those. He goes to college campuses and say, hi, come work as a chemical engineer for my company. I'll pay you $100,000 a year, $150,000 a year, whatever it is. And come to St. Louis and it'll be great. 150 grand is a lot of money in St. Louis. And he knows how to recruit those people, but he's got just dozens and dozens and dozens of jobs that are good paying jobs, $25, $30 an hour in warehouses for forklift operators, for people who do various kinds of, not skilled labor exactly, but labor you have to be trained for. And he couldn't fill those jobs. He raised the salaries, he raised the wages, offered better benefits, all that kind of stuff. He just couldn't get people to take those jobs. And the same day I talked to him, I was walking around in actually East St. Louis in Illinois, and talking to people there and having people tell me, well, there are no jobs to be had. We'd love to work for a living and not be dependent on welfare and dependent on other things, but where am I ever going to find a decent job? And I just want to tell them, a 30-minute drive away, a 35-minute drive away, however far it was, and it wasn't very far. I saw this in Pennsylvania, where you've got people in the Philadelphia area who just, will talk all day about how there are no good blue collar jobs. And on the other side of the same state, there are these oil and gas operators who are desperate to hire people and can't. And now the energy business has seen a little snafu in the last few months, but it'll recover from it. And one of the things that really was an interesting change for me is I follow this stuff, and it used to be that you'd hear these ads on the radio for fracking operations, and they would say, do you have a commercial driver's license? If so, give us a call, we'll hire you and pay you a ton of money to come drive a water truck in our fracking operations. And after a couple of years, the ads changed, and they were no longer, do you have a commercial driver's license? It was, are you eligible to get a commercial driver's license? If so, we'll hire you, pay you to get your CDL, and then give you a job afterward. Now, it's not to say that everybody who wants a good job paying $80,000 a year, $100,000 a year can have one tomorrow if they want it, but there's a lot of work out there that's not being done. And again, I think it's, people don't necessarily know how to connect to it. I suspect that if you went to any of your local high schools and asked kids about what's a commercial driver's license, how do you get one, what does it mean you can do, what kind of jobs are associated with it, they might have an idea about truck drivers a little bit, but they wouldn't really understand the rest of the stuff that goes along with that. And I think this is partly because our obsession with college education, including college education for people who are not really going to benefit from it, either economically or intellectually, crowds out a lot of other conversations we could and should be having about useful and productive things that people can be doing for a living.
And yeah, I definitely seen the same thing with welders. A few years ago, it was if you're a welder, we got a job for you, and then it changed to if you would like to learn to weld,
Yeah.
you can apply.
Yep.
Here's a question from Michael Wolf regarding if we were only to focus on the people around us immediately in our circle, would some of these problems resolve themselves? And I recall Robert Putnam's book a few years ago, Bowling Alone, and the kind of breakdown on some of these other institutional factors. What are your thoughts on kind of that? I mean, church, family breakdowns, other social structures, how much does that play into some of these problems?
Yeah, I mean, all of these things are factors. I mean, we can't underestimate the role of the individual and the role that of the choices we make in our own lives and what kind of people we are, even if we don't necessarily choose to be those kinds of people. I used to live in a place called Lower Merion, which is one of the wealthiest communities in the United States. It's the main line west of Philadelphia, as it's known, and a lot of old money sort of polo playing people out there. Steeplechase is real big. And there was a guy who lived down the street from me in a longish-term transitional housing. He'd been homeless, been in jail a few times. He was in his 50s, I guess. And they acquired, the county, I guess, acquired some apartments in that neighborhood and started putting up people in there who had been homeless. And so he had his, own little place, and he had to pay some kind of rent on it, but it was $50 a month or something like that. And so I got to know this guy because it was a smallish town, and he lived on my street. And so we struck up a conversation one day. We both liked motorcycles, and so I got to know him pretty well over the years. We were neighbors for a long time, and so he had housing pretty well squared away at public expense mainly, and certain kinds of payment, healthcare taken care of, that sort of thing. And I mean, perhaps not the greatest healthcare services anyway, but he had, psychiatric services and addiction services and all that. And he'd got himself sober. He wasn't drinking anymore, wasn't using methamphetamine, which he had a problem with. But it was clear to me that he was never going to get to a place in life where he could hold down a job and take care of himself. He was, by that point, just simply too far down the path he had gone down to come back from it. And probably this had to do with he had some mental problems related to a couple of motorcycle accidents he'd had, and with brain damage relating from that. So at some point you have to say, well, what are we going to do with someone like this? Because our choices essentially are maintain them in a state of dependency indefinitely, probably for the rest of their lives, or let them go. And I don't think let them go is a choice that we're actually going to make. We're not going to let people starve in the streets. We're just not going to do that. It's not the kind of society we are, and we have the resources not to do it. But I think we have to be pretty clear-eyed about what our real choices are in some of these cases. Now, there are other people, we're talking about people who are maybe 25, who've had, addiction problems, or coming out of jail, they've got other things. At that point in someone's life, you can still intervene, I think, in a pretty aggressive way. What's lacking is families and communities, I think, really, that are able to help direct people to, go the right way. I mean, I was very lucky in that, where I came up, none in my family had ever gone to college or anything like that. My father didn't finish high school. And I didn't really know anything about, well, how does one go to college? What does the application process look like? What do you do about financial aid? These sorts of things. But there were people in my community, my friends' parents, that sort of thing, who were able to, give me some direction about that stuff, and who were able to help me to understand what my path in life could look like and the things I would need to do to make that happen. I wasn't able to get that from my own family, but I was able to get it from other people in my community. And there are a lot of people who simply don't have that either. I did a piece about this economic development project in the Bronx that fell apart and ended up not happening. And I talked to a guy up there who was in his 40s, I guess, and he'd never had a job. And he had never really known a man who had had a job. Women in his life had jobs. Like he had some children with a woman, and she had a job. His mother had had a job. Didn't know his father, I don't think. But the idea of being a person who shows up at a place every day and does a certain job for a certain period of time and gets paid X per hour to do it just was not on his radar. And I remember talking to him about it. He reminded me a little bit of these people in the homeless camp in Austin that he was saying he thought he might want to start a nightclub, like a bar. And I thought, well, it's great business in New York City, but you are a convicted felon. And do you know how liquor licenses work? Because you're going to have a hard time getting one probably. And, but, it was a guy in his 40s who thought, well, maybe I'll just, start a nightclub someday. And that's not really a realistic course of action for someone like that. But there are realistic courses of action for people. And again, it's easier the younger you get people started on the right path, the less difficulty you have taking them off the wrong one. But they need help and they need information and they need a vision not only of what their lives could be that's realistic, but a pretty well-defined path for getting there. And I think that's what we're lacking. And that's not really going to come from Washington or from the state capitals. Mainly, there are things they can do to support that. Fixing the public schools in places like Philadelphia and Atlanta would be a big step in the right direction. And that's something that is within the power of these institutions to do, although they're not going to do it. But it's not something that we can pass a law and mandate that people have better families and happier communities and they take more responsibility for themselves. It's not going to respond to regulations or subsidies or targeted tax breaks or any of the things that we conservatives tend to be used to in our policy toolbox.
That's a big topic. That's the topic for another book and for our friends at the Show Me Institute to take on, fixing public schools and some of those policy issues. Going back to something you said earlier on the casino gambling, what are your thoughts on what Edward says is the inevitable legalization of marijuana? And how does it relate to your comments on casino gambling?
Well, there's a long piece in the book about the legalization project in Colorado and the effects of it. And one of the things about marijuana legalization that I've noticed and I've reported on is that it's a little bit like the situation with legalizing prostitution. So as some of you probably know, prostitution is legal in some parts of Nevada, although not actually in Las Vegas. People often misunderstand that. It's not legal in Clark County, but it's legal places that are pretty close to there. And so the libertarian theory of this stuff is that if we legalize it, we can, have it in a kind of structured, regulated, profit-oriented environment in which the self-interest of business operators and entrepreneurs will help to mitigate some of the social problems associated with that. And it just simply doesn't work in the case of prostitution in Nevada. Now, certainly the legal prostitution that you have in the brothels is much better for everyone involved, I think, than the street level prostitution that you see on, West Tropicana in Las Vegas. But it hasn't alleviated that problem. And the reason it hasn't alleviated that problem is because the people involved in street level prostitution in Las Vegas are underage, mentally ill, suffering from terrible addiction problems, HIV positive, or have other things that can keep them from being able to work in a legalized environment. Similarly, in Colorado, we still have a big problem with organized crime and drug smuggling, even though marijuana has been legalized there. So a lot of the states neighboring Colorado, Nebraska, I guess particularly, they get pretty irritated by the fact that every time they stop a car of teenagers coming out of Colorado, that they've got marijuana in the car. And it was legal to buy it in Colorado, but it wasn't actually legal to buy it in Colorado because they're coming back with 20 and 25 pounds from a state in which a person can only legally buy like a half a gram or something like that. So even though you've got legalized marijuana in Colorado, you've still got a huge problem with cartels and other organized crime syndicates that have penetrated, for instance, the grow facilities. So they're able to divert some of the legally grown marijuana onto the black market. In the same way that there's still a market for smuggled cigarettes in some places because cigarette taxes are very high in some jurisdictions. So legalizing marijuana probably has brought some improvements. And it's certainly better that most people who use marijuana in Colorado are able to do so through a legal business that has basic health standards and isn't run by gangsters and that sort of thing. But it hasn't really reduced the other social problems that go along with drug use as much as we would expect it to or might have hoped for it to. So while I do take a pretty libertarian view of these things, I think in general, we're better off with a more liberal and more legalized environment for things like marijuana and other drugs and gambling and other stuff as well. I think we can't afford to be Pollyannas about what that really means socially. And that legalized marijuana is going to mean more marijuana users, more use of other kinds of drugs. And some people, not a huge proportion, but some proportion of the people who use those drugs are going to develop problems with them. Even marijuana people develop problems with. There's kind of an urban legend that you can't really become addicted to marijuana. People actually do. And some people have terrible, terrible habits, and they find it really difficult to quit. And it imposes all sorts of costs on their lives, and therefore imposes costs on people around them. So if it eventually helps to put the cartels and the transnational drug trade out of business by making it less profitable to run a black market operation than to run a legal operation, then I think that's a development to be celebrated and to be welcomed. But there are going to be all sorts of other problems that are not going to be reduced by this, in the same sense that our number one substance abuse problem in this country is alcohol, which is legal everywhere.
All right, I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 quick questions.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew Yang made a big splash with the concept of universal basic income, and a lot of that he was tying to some of these issues. Some people dismissed it, but I looked at it like, well, Milton Friedman advocated for something similar by way of a negative income tax 60 years ago, so it's not a new concept.
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
I'm much more a fan of the negative income tax than I am of the universal basic income for a couple of reasons. One is I think we want to incentivize work rather than disincentivize it, because we want people to be on a path in life that is going to enable them to earn an income on their own terms, not just from the UBI or something like that. I also worry about Americans are very innovative when it comes to finance. And there are all these companies out there that will, buy you out of your lawsuit settlement or buy you out of your annuities, buy you out of lottery payouts or things like that. There will be people who will come up with a product to buy you out of your UBI, who give you some, lump sum of money and collect your UBI for the rest of their lives, or will simply loan people money in excess of their inability to pay and leverage the UBI as a way to get repaid on that. So there are things that I worry about on that front. One of the things I do like to emphasize, though, is that while I don't think the UBI is a very good idea, it would probably be a better idea than the current welfare state as such. And in the imaginary world in which we could completely replace the current welfare state with a UBI, then yeah, maybe I would take that trade. But one of the things I do like to emphasize is that our ability to deal with social problems, whether it's poverty, whether it's lack of education, is not really constrained by money. We are a very, very wealthy society, and we already spend a lot of money on these issues. People talk about the underfunded city schools when, in Philadelphia, they spend more per student to get crappy results than some of the suburban schools spend to get better results. It's not a matter of money. We've got enough money to deal with the poverty we have and the poverty we can reasonably expect to see. We have enough money to deal with most of the social problems we have that can be dealt with financially anyway. Our constraints are institutional. We've got plenty of money to spend on education. We don't have good schools in which to spend it and good school districts in which to spend it. We've got plenty of money to spend on all sorts of social programs, but the social programs you're spending money on don't provide the results we would like them to. So we need more innovation in the program design front. We need more innovation in understanding that there is no sort of single size model for things like education or poverty abatement, where there's people who are poor for all sorts of different reasons, and it's going to require a lot of different policy approaches to deal with those different reasons, in the same way that there's no such thing as a good model of education, because you've got a lot of different kinds of students who need different kinds of things. So we have to have a multiplicity of solutions, but we tend to think, well, we're spending $100 billion a year on anti-poverty programs this year. We'll spend $120 billion next year. We should get 20% better results because we're spending 20% more. It's not actually how it works. And so we should stop thinking ourselves as being constrained in terms of dollars and therefore able to solve our problems in terms of putting more dollars into it, and thinking a lot more deeply about the actual social realities and the actual questions of program design and implementation that are the nuts and bolts stuff that we should be doing, that we really should be relying on government to take care of, but the government simply, for the most part, refuses to even halfway seriously address.
If you have time, two more quick questions. Our good friend Jim Caesar asks, he works with a lot of kids in high school and notes that a lot of them only rely on peer information. That they don't trust advice from adults. Have you encountered this? How do you work with kids who may be facing these issues?
I don't have a lot of personal experience in that, to be honest. So, I've taught college and such things, but the kids I taught were high achieving, highly motivated kids from families and communities that pushed them in that direction. So I don't know what the average American high school student really is like very much, to be honest. So I'm not sure I've got very much useful to offer in terms of an answer to that question.
That's fine. But I do want to ask one more, and this one actually harkens back more to your last book, and it comes from our good friend Mike in Minnesota, who asks about cancel culture. This isn't totally related to your current book, but it is to your last one. He wonders how conservatives should think about the destruction of statuary and the condemnation of people by social media cadres. Just your overall thoughts on this. So I think we may be asking you to sum up your last book in a few sentences.
In my last book, it could be summed up that people are dumb and angry, and people in large groups get exponentially more dumb and angry, not in a simple additive way. So I think social media obviously brings out the worst in people and communities, and particularly in politics. But it only does so because we have this kind of unspoken social agreement to allow it to do so. I don't use any social media. I don't use Twitter, I don't use Facebook, I don't use any of that sort of stuff. My life has not seemed to lack anything in not doing that. So the fact that someone who is typically anonymous, typically unserious, who is going to do the very, very low investment thing of tweeting at someone, you're a racist, or you're a sexist, or you're a terrible human being, or you're a Stalinist, you're a communist, you're a socialist, whatever. There isn't any reason to take that person seriously or to assign any value to their words, or their thoughts, or their participation in public affairs. So one of the things I've written about a lot and that I think about a lot is that we often talk about the relationship of the citizenry to the institutions as being a problem of insufficient equality. That we're the real people, and the elites in Washington and the swamp keep us from getting what we want, and they frustrate us from achieving the things we could do. And if only we had the power that they have, then we get better outcomes. I don't think this country suffers from insufficient equality. I think this country suffers from insufficient hierarchy. That there are people out there who don't really know where to go for authoritative information or insights about things, that don't have institutions that they can trust to solve complex problems that they can't solve themselves. I'm a big believer in the value of understanding rational ignorance, that most of us know a little bit about one thing and almost nothing about everything else that's of any consequence. And if you look at the things the average member of Congress has to deal with, Syria, China, entitlement reform, taxes, do I vote for this judge or not vote for this judge if I'm in the Senate? Even someone whose job it is to do this stuff all day can't do it, can't keep up with it, doesn't have the ability to actually acquire the information and insight to be an expert on all the things you really need to be an expert on, much less the regular citizen who has a job not related to this stuff and family to take care of and other sorts of obligations. So we've had this great leveling, partly enabled by technology and social media. And it's really cost us something that is useful and valuable and really irreplaceable, which is authority. Authority that we can trust in, and delegate to. And without that, we're in this mess of, well, Bob on Twitter says that, President Trump is fighting a cabal of satanic pedophiles. That's how we should organize our thinking. And one piece in the book on this front, by the way, that I really would recommend to everyone, and I hope you will read it, is it's called Among the Flat Earthers. And I went to cover a convention of people who believe the earth is flat. And it was just an intensified version of regular American politics. People who believe crazy things with no evidence for reasons that have nothing to do with what allegedly is the subject at hand. And I think it was for me anyway, a really useful and illuminating experience. And I hope that you'll get something useful out of reading about it.
Well, I know I have a lot more questions, and I'm sure our participants do, but I guess that'll incentivize us to all go out and buy the book and look for some answers there. So thank you so much, Kevin, for your time. Thank you, everyone on this call, for joining us. Thank you, Brenda, and all our friends at the Show Me Institute for hosting us. Kevin's book is on Amazon. You can pre-order it. It's in the chat box. We will send out an email after this as well with what'll have information on that. So again, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you so much, Kevin, for writing this book and for your time.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks.